Exactly 2 hours after I watched my parents lowered into the ground, my brother slammed a 24-hour eviction notice onto the marble kitchen island. He looked me dead in the eye and announced he was taking the family mansion and the $32 million logistics empire. He thought he had won. He had no idea that his arrogance had just triggered a hidden clause in a will. He was too lazy to read a clause that would leave him begging for mercy. I am Claire, 34 years old, and a senior forensic accountant. Before I dive into exactly how I systematically dismantled my brother's life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to an entitled family member who mistook your silence for weakness. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, our family projected an image of untouchable success. My parents built a massive commercial logistics company from the ground up, turning a single delivery truck into a $32 million empire. But behind the iron gates of our sprawling stone estate, the reality was entirely different. I spent my life as the invisible daughter, the reliable one who kept her head down, studied hard, and asked for nothing. My older brother Preston, on the other hand, was the golden child. At 37, Preston had never held a real job for more than a year. He bounced from one failed tech startup to another, always bailed out by our father's deep pockets and endless patience. For the past 3 years, while Preston was living in a downtown penthouse fully funded by the family company, I was living in my childhood bedroom. I had put my entire life on hold, moving back into the estate to provide round-the-clock end-of-life care for both of my parents, as their health simultaneously and rapidly declined. I worked remotely, balancing complex financial audits for my firm, while managing hospice nurses, organizing multiple daily medications, and coordinating endless doctor appointments. Preston visited exactly twice a year on major holidays, and usually left early after cornering our deteriorating father to ask for a large check to fund his lavish lifestyle. The house was suffocatingly quiet. The catered memorial reception had just ended, and the last of the distant relatives had finally driven their luxury cars down our winding driveway, leaving behind an echoing emptiness. I stood at the massive kitchen island, staring blankly out the window at the sprawling back lawn. My feet ached deeply in my black heels. My eyes were swollen and gritty from crying, and my entire body felt heavy with the bone-chilling exhaustion that only comes from years of relentless caregiving. I was numbly washing the delicate porcelain coffee cups, watching the soapy water swirl down the drain, trying to process the overwhelming reality that I was now truly an orphan. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen suddenly swung open violently, breaking the fragile silence of the morning house. Preston strutted in, adjusting the expensive cufflinks of his tailored black suit. He looked more like an arrogant executive arriving at a hostile corporate takeover than a grieving son who had just buried the people who gave him life. Right beside him was his wife, Naomi. Naomi is a 35-year-old woman whose entire personality revolves around displaying garish designer logos and pretending she comes from generations of old wealth. She clutched a brand-new luxury handbag that probably cost more than my first vehicle, her sharp stilettos clicking aggressively against the imported tile floor. Neither of them offered me a comforting hug. Neither of them asked how I was holding up after holding our mother's frail hand, as she took her final agonizing breath just days ago. Instead, Preston marched straight up to the island and slapped a crisp white piece of paper onto the marble counter right next to my soapy sponge. The sharp slapping sound echoed in the large, cavernous kitchen, cutting fiercely through the heavy grief hanging in the room. "Sign it, and start packing." Preston commanded, his voice completely devoid of any warmth, sadness, or basic human decency. I slowly turned off the brass faucet. I deliberately dried my hands on a linen towel and looked down at the paper. It was a formal, legally binding 24-hour eviction notice, demanding I vacate the premises immediately. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, but years of forensic accounting, of staring down hostile corporate embezzlers and uncooperative executives in tense boardrooms, had taught me exactly how to keep my face completely unreadable. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I looked back up at my brother, studying his smug, intensely entitled expression. We just buried them, Preston, I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level and steady. The dirt is not even settled on their graves yet. Business is business, Claire, he sneered, leaning his palms heavily on the counter to try and physically intimidate me. As the eldest son, I am the sole executor of the estate. Dad made it very clear before he lost his mind that I was the only one with the actual vision to take over the logistics company. The entire $32 million is under my direct control now, and this house is mine. You do not belong here anymore. I stared at him, letting his harsh words hang suspended in the silent air. The sheer audacity of his claim was almost staggering to witness. Preston had not attended a single company board meeting in his entire adult life. He did not know the name of a single warehouse manager, logistics coordinator, or truck driver that kept the business running. He genuinely thought running a massive multi-million-dollar empire was just about wearing expensive bespoke suits and cashing enormous quarterly checks. But I let him talk. I let him build his glorious fantasy because I knew a massive secret that he did not. Naomi stepped forward, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on her flawlessly painted lips. She ran her manicured fingers over the expensive marble countertop as if she already owned the very stone beneath my hands. She looked around the beautiful kitchen with a look of utter disgust, as if my mere presence was somehow contaminating her new grand castle. "You have had a free ride here for 3 years, Claire," Naomi said, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. "But Preston and I are moving in tomorrow morning. We are hiring a top-tier interior decorator to gut this entire place and modernize it from the ground up. It is entirely too gloomy and depressing for our taste. You need to be completely gone by noon. We do not want your depressing energy ruining our fresh start as the new heads of the family." I looked directly at Naomi, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, standing in my deceased parents' kitchen, telling me I had a free ride after I had spent the last 3 grueling years changing adult diapers, cleaning up sickness, and administering liquid morphine while she sipped expensive champagne at exclusive charity galas. The profound hypocrisy was so thick, I could almost physically choke on it. But I kept my jaw firmly locked. I absolutely refused to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing me cry or lose my temper. Naomi was not finished asserting her sudden perceived dominance. She leaned in closer, her dark eyes gleaming with malicious delight, ready to deliver what she firmly believed would be the final crushing blow to my spirit. "Oh, and make sure you clear all your little gardening tools out of that pathetic greenhouse out back," Naomi added, waving her hand dismissively toward the large bay window that overlooked the gardens. "That is the very first thing getting bulldozed tomorrow morning. We need the space for our new luxury pool house, and your little tomato plants are standing in the way of progress." The greenhouse. My chest tightened for just a fraction of a second. During the darkest, most terrifying days of my parents' prolonged illness, when the main house constantly smelled of strong antiseptic and approaching death, the greenhouse had been my only quiet refuge. It was a stunning vintage glass structure my grandfather had built where I cultivated rare exotic orchids and seasonal vegetables. It was the only secure place I could go to breathe deeply, to scream into the empty void, to break down and cry without my dying parents hearing my despair. Naomi knew exactly what that sacred space meant to my survival. Destroying it was not a real estate decision, it was about brutally erasing my footprint from this family forever. I did not look at the window. I did not let Naomi see even a flicker of the devastation her words caused. Instead, I turned my attention back to my brother, who was standing there with his chest puffed out like a proud peacock who had just conquered an empty castle. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, closing the physical distance between us. I did not raise my voice, but the temperature in the sprawling kitchen seemed to plummet. "Do you have any idea what the last 3 years actually looked like inside these walls?" "Preston," I asked, my tone dangerously even. I asked him if he remembered the terrifying night Dad had his second major stroke. I reminded him that he was in Miami, popping expensive bottles of champagne at a waterfront club, on our father's platinum credit card while I was riding in the back of a speeding ambulance, pressing a bloody towel to our father's mouth. I laid out the stark reality of our lives. While he was living in a luxury downtown penthouse playing the role of a hotshot CEO for tech startups that never even launched, I was grinding out 60-hour work weeks at my accounting firm and coming home to bathe our dying mother. I sacrificed the prime years of my early 30s, my social life, and my peace of mind to make sure the people who gave us life died with dignity. Preston stared at me for a long moment, and then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, ugly sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He looked at Naomi, who was grinning in amusement, and then he looked back at me, shaking his head in mock pity. "Oh, please, Claire, spare me the dramatic martyr routine," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "You stayed here because you have absolutely no life of your own. You do not have a husband, you do not have a family, and you hide behind your boring spreadsheet job because you are terrified of the real world. Being a nursemaid was the most exciting thing you had going for you." My jaw tightened, but I remained perfectly still, letting him dig his grave deeper with every arrogant word. Our parents knew the truth. Preston continued stepping closer and pointing a finger at his own chest. Dad knew that running a massive commercial logistics empire requires raw charisma, aggressive networking, and big picture vision. You sit in a gray cubicle looking at tax codes all day. You are a glorified human calculator. You have zero business instincts. Dad knew I was the only one in this entire family who could take a $32 million company and turn it into a billion-dollar global enterprise. That is exactly why he left me in charge and left you with nothing. You lack the killer instinct, Claire. You always have. Naomi stepped up beside him, linking her arm through his and resting her head on his shoulder in a display of sickening solidarity. She looked at me with cold, empty eyes. "You heard the executor of the estate. Claire," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative, "we want you off the property by noon tomorrow. Leave the keys on the counter." In my line of work as a senior forensic accountant, I deal with corporate fraudsters, embezzlers, and arrogant executives every single day. I have sat across from men twice Preston's size who tried to intimidate me into looking the other way when their financial books did not balance. My profession taught me one invaluable lesson about dealing with hostile, arrogant people. You never interrupt your enemy when they are making a fatal mistake. You let them talk. You let them build their glorious fantasy of absolute power. And most importantly, you never ever show them your hand until the trap is fully set and the escape routes are completely locked. I realized in that exact moment that fighting with them was a useless waste of my energy. They were entirely disconnected from reality, drunk on the illusion of sudden, unearned wealth. So I simply nodded. I gave them a blank professional stare, turned around, and walked out of the kitchen. I walked up the grand curved staircase, tracing my hand lightly along the polished mahogany railing for the very last time. When I reached my childhood bedroom, I did not hesitate. I pulled my sturdy black leather duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet and began to pack. I moved with systematic precision, completely disconnecting my emotions from the physical act of leaving. I packed only my bare essentials: my tailored business suits, my sensible flat shoes, a few casual outfits, and my heavy corporate documents. I intentionally left all the sentimental jewelry, the expensive birthday gifts from our parents, and the lavish designer clothes hanging in the closet. I did not want a single physical object that tied me to their toxic legacy or their conditional love. Once my clothes were packed, I sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled my work laptop from my briefcase. I flipped it open and typed in my complex security credentials, bypassing the firm's encrypted firewall. I stared at the bright desktop screen. Right there in the upper right corner, isolated from all my other case files, was a heavily password-protected folder. I had named it Project Icarus. I stared at the little yellow folder icon, and a cold, satisfying calm washed over my entire body. Project Icarus contained 3 years of meticulous financial auditing. It held thousands of pages of bank transfers, trust fund mandates, hidden corporate ledgers, and binding legal statutes regarding the true nature of our parents' estate. Preston honestly believed he was inheriting a clean $32 million empire. But what Project Icarus proved in absolute, undeniable black and white ink was that he was inheriting a financial minefield that I had personally helped our parents rig. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap and slid it safely into my leather briefcase. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked back downstairs. The heavy thud of my boots on the wooden steps echoed through the quiet foyer. Preston and Naomi were already standing in the massive formal living room. Naomi was holding a measuring tape against the antique silk wallpaper, talking loudly about tearing down the original moldings to create an open-concept entertainment space. They looked up as I entered the room, bags in hand. Preston smirked, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He held out his open palm, expecting me to drop my life at his feet. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy brass ring of house keys. This ring held the keys to the wrought iron front gates, the heavy mahogany main doors, the exterior security boxes, and the company vaults located in the basement. It was the physical weight of the entire estate. I walked right up to him and dropped the heavy metal ring directly into his waiting hand. The keys clattered loudly against his palm. He closed his fist around them, his smile widening into a triumphant grin. He thought my quiet compliance was a total unconditional surrender. He thought he had broken me. I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression entirely, completely hollow. "I hope you understand what it actually costs to run this house, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because the bills do not stop just because you feel like a king." Preston just scoffed and pocketed the keys. "Do not worry about my finances, little sister," he mocked, turning his back on me to look at the living room walls. "I think my $32 million logistics empire can handle the electric bill. Have a nice life, Claire. Do not expect an invitation to the housewarming party." I did not say another word. I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag on my shoulder, turned around, and walked out the heavy front doors. The crisp evening air hit my face instantly, clearing the suffocating tension of the house from my lungs. I walked down the long driveway toward my modest sedan, parked near the gates. I did not look back at the massive stone mansion. I did not look back at the greenhouse. I just started my car, pulled out onto the quiet suburban street, and began the process of letting them completely destroy themselves. I woke up the next morning in the parking lot of a sterile 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. I had reclined the seat of my sedan and slept fitfully, wrapped in my winter coat. My back ached and my eyes burned from the dry air, but my mind was already racing. I needed a hot shower, a strong coffee, and a secure internet connection to begin executing my strategy. I drove to an upscale cafe downtown, intending to grab a quick breakfast before finding a proper place to stay. The cafe was bustling with morning commuters, and the rich aroma of roasted espresso beans filled the warm air. I ordered a large black coffee and a warm pastry. The cheerful barista smiled and announced my total. I pulled out my primary personal debit card and handed it over without a second thought. I had over $80,000 in that checking account, money I had painstakingly saved from my firm bonuses over the years. I watched the barista swipe the card. The digital register beeped a harsh metallic sound of rejection. The barista frowned and tried tapping the chip. Another sharp beep. She looked up at me apologetically and said her machine was declining the transaction. I felt a tiny prickle of confusion, but simply nodded and handed her my backup personal credit card. She inserted it into the reader. Denied. The small line of customers behind me began to shift impatiently. The barista handed the cards back with a sympathetic grimace, suggesting I might need to call my bank to clear a fraud alert. I thanked her, left my coffee on the counter, and stepped outside into the brisk morning air. I unlocked my phone and immediately opened my mobile banking application. The screen loaded and my stomach dropped into my shoes. A glaring red banner stretched across the top of my financial dashboard. Account frozen, executor mandate. I tapped rapidly into my checking account, my savings account, and my emergency liquid funds. Every single one of them displayed a balance of zero with a strict administrative lock placed on all outbound transfers. My phone buzzed heavily in my palm. A text message notification popped up on the screen. It was from Preston. "Morning, Claire," the text read. "Just executing my legal duties as the head of the estate. I found the old financial ledgers from 8 years ago. They clearly show Mom and Dad paid the tuition for your expensive accounting degree. Since you clearly manipulated two sick elderly people into funding your personal life, I have officially seized your personal accounts as immediate reimbursement to the estate. You are completely cut off. Consider this your first real lesson in financial independence. If you need money for food, you know exactly who to call." I stood frozen on the busy sidewalk as pedestrians bumped past me. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of his message was staggering. Preston genuinely believed he had just delivered a masterstroke of retaliation. He thought he had severed my lifeline, leaving me stranded, starving, and desperate on the street. He expected me to call him within the hour, sobbing frantically and begging for access to my own hard-earned money so I could buy breakfast. But Preston had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had absolutely no idea how banking laws actually worked. You cannot unilaterally seize a living person's private bank accounts without a formal court order, even if you are the executor of an estate. The only way Preston could have successfully frozen my personal assets overnight was by committing outright bank fraud. He likely walked into the local branch where our parents held their primary accounts, flashed his temporary executor paperwork, and blatantly lied to a junior branch manager, claiming my personal accounts were legally tethered to the deceased estate. It was a reckless amateur move fueled purely by his desperate need to control me. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Preston had just handed me the first actionable piece of criminal evidence on a silver platter. I opened my wallet again and slid my finger right past the useless frozen personal plastic. Tucked securely in the very back slot was a sleek, heavy titanium card. It was my elite corporate expense card, issued directly by the senior partners at my forensic accounting firm. Because I handled international audits and high-level corporate fraud investigations, the firm provided me with an untethered expense account, with a staggeringly high limit. Preston had no idea this card existed, because he never bothered to learn anything about my career. He thought I was just a low-level desk clerk pushing papers. I walked directly to my car and drove straight to the Grand Monarch Hotel. It was the most exclusive five-star luxury hotel in the downtown district, a towering building of polished glass and imported marble that catered exclusively to visiting diplomats and wealthy executives. I pulled my modest sedan up to the valet, handed over my keys, and walked through the gleaming brass revolving doors. The lobby smelled of fresh lilies and expensive cedar. I approached the front desk and handed the immaculate concierge my titanium card. I requested their premium executive suite for an indefinite stay. The concierge barely blinked. He swiped the heavy metal card, handed me a pair of digital room keys, and signaled a bellhop to grab my leather duffel bag. Within 10 minutes, I was standing in the center of a massive top-floor suite featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The room had a massive king-sized bed, a marble soaking tub, and most importantly, a heavy mahogany desk equipped with high-speed encrypted internet. I ordered a massive breakfast spread from room service, including the black coffee I was previously denied. While I waited for the food to arrive, I unpacked my work laptop and set up my temporary command center on the mahogany desk. I connected to the secure firm network and pulled up the digital banking logs Preston had just compromised. I took high-resolution screenshots of the frozen accounts, the illegal executor mandate notice, and the smug text message he had sent me. I carefully organized everything into a new subfolder inside Project Icarus, labeling it Exhibit a Bank Fraud. Then I picked up my cell phone. I did not dial Preston's number. I did not call Naomi to scream at her. I dialed a direct internal line to a senior investigator at the Internal Revenue Service. In my line of work, you build incredibly valuable relationships with federal regulators. The man who answered the phone was an older veteran agent named Agent Miller, who had worked alongside my firm on several massive corporate embezzlement cases. He respected my meticulous auditing skills and knew that if I was calling his direct line, I was not wasting his time. "Good morning, Agent Miller," I said, keeping my voice crisp and entirely professional. "I need to report a highly irregular and unauthorized seizure of funds involving a newly appointed estate executor. The executor has illegally leveraged a deceased person's estate paperwork to commit identity fraud and unlawfully freeze private citizen accounts." Agent Miller immediately shifted into his professional gear, asking for the specific details. I read off the estate tax identification numbers, our parents' holding company credentials, and Preston's full legal name. I calmly explained that the executor was already mingling estate funds with his personal assets and had committed wire fraud by attempting to seize my independent savings across state banking lines. "I am sending you the preliminary documentation now," I told him, hitting the send button on an encrypted email containing the screenshots. "I highly recommend placing an immediate federal monitor on the logistics company operating accounts. The executor is highly erratic and currently burning through liquid capital that is slated for the upcoming quarterly corporate tax liabilities. If he liquidates those accounts before the tax deadline, the federal government will be out millions." Agent Miller thanked me profusely. He assured me that his division would quietly flag the estate accounts and begin monitoring every single outgoing wire transfer Preston attempted to make. Preston thought he was playing a fun game of family dominance. He did not realize he had just walked blindly onto a chessboard where I controlled every single piece. I hung up the phone just as room service knocked on my suite door. I enjoyed my hot coffee and fluffy eggs, looking out over the city entirely at peace. My brother had thrown the first punch, but he was entirely unarmed for the war he had just started. After finishing my room service breakfast, I leaned back in the plush leather chair and picked up my phone. I decided it was time to check the public fallout of my departure from the estate. I tapped the social media application on my screen. I did not even have to search for Naomi, because her face was the very first thing that popped up on my main feed. She had gone live on her profile just an hour earlier. She was sitting in the grand foyer of our family estate, holding her phone at a high angle to capture the massive crystal chandelier sparkling behind her. She had applied a heavy beauty filter that smoothed her skin into synthetic perfection, but she was putting on an incredibly dramatic performance for the camera. She dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes with a tissue, looking thoroughly exhausted. "It has been such an incredibly heavy week, you guys," Naomi told her thousands of followers, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. Losing Preston's parents was a massive tragedy, but stepping up to take over the family legacy is so overwhelming. We are carrying the weight of a $32 million empire on our shoulders now. And honestly, the hardest part has not been managing the business. It has been dealing with toxic family members. She leaned into the camera, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, playing the role of the burdened matriarch to perfection. "We had to make the agonizing decision to remove a family member from the property today. Someone who has been freeloading off my in-laws for years, refusing to work a real job, and just dragging down the energy of this beautiful house. Setting boundaries is so hard, but Preston is such a strong protector. We are finally cleansing this space and protecting our peace." I watched the comments roll in on her video broadcast. Hundreds of strangers were sending her heart emojis, calling her brave and praising Preston for protecting his wife from his supposedly lazy and toxic sister. Naomi was spinning a calculated public narrative, painting herself as the exhausted hero and me as the bitter squatter. She was laying the groundwork so that when I inevitably disappeared from their lives, all of their wealthy friends would simply assume I was a disgraced outcast who had been rightfully banished. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. In the world of forensic accounting, documentation is everything. I screen recorded the entire 10-minute broadcast and saved it directly into the encrypted Project Icarus folder on my phone. It was not just an annoying video of my sister-in-law. It was documented public proof that they were claiming full operational ownership of the estate and publicly defaming my character. Before I could even close the social media application, a new text message chimed at the top of my screen. It was from Preston. There were no words at first, just a high-resolution photograph. I tapped the image to enlarge it. It was a picture taken in the circular driveway of the family mansion. Sitting right in the center of the pristine cobblestones was a massive rusted green construction dumpster. And piled haphazardly inside that metal bin were pieces of my childhood and my entire life. I saw the handmade floral quilt my grandmother had stitched for my 10th birthday. I saw my high school debate trophies tossed carelessly on top of broken terracotta garden pots from my greenhouse. I saw the wooden memory box that held the dried flowers from my mother's wedding bouquet. All of it thrown away like meaningless rotting garbage. A second text arrived immediately after the photograph. "Cleaning house today," Preston wrote, "getting rid of the dead weight. But I am not an unreasonable man, Claire. I know you are probably sitting in your car right now wondering how you are going to afford your next meal. I can fix that for you. I will make a call and unfreeze your personal bank accounts by noon. I will even cut you a $10,000 pity check directly from the estate to help you get a cheap apartment." But there is a catch. A third text came through containing a link to a digital document. "You have to sign this legal waiver," Preston demanded. "It officially states that you forfeit any and all rights to contest our parents' will or make any future financial claims against the estate. You sign the paper, you get your little bank accounts back and 10 grand to disappear. Do we have a deal? Or do you want to sleep in a parking lot again tonight?" I read the messages twice to ensure I was fully grasping the sheer magnitude of his stupidity. Preston was putting his entire extortion scheme in writing. He was explicitly admitting that he had the power to freeze and unfreeze my private funds, proving he had orchestrated the illegal bank mandate. And he was openly using those stolen funds to extort a legal signature from me. In the legal world, this is not just playing dirty, it is textbook coercion. If a judge saw these text messages, Preston would not just lose his executor status, he would face immediate criminal charges. I did not feel the sting of seeing my childhood quilt buried in a construction dumpster. I did not feel humiliated by Naomi's fake tears on the internet. I only felt the cold, calculated thrill of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a steel trap. Preston wanted a signature to make him feel safe and powerful. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I typed a single thumbs-up emoji and hit send. No angry words, no begging for my belongings, just a simple digital agreement. I stood up from the mahogany desk and walked down to the hotel business center located on the second floor. The room was completely empty and smelled faintly of fresh printer ink and expensive carpet. I logged onto the secure terminal and accessed the digital link Preston had sent me. It was a boilerplate legal waiver likely downloaded for free from a cheap legal website. It was full of glaring formatting errors and loopholes, but the core intent was clear. It demanded I surrender my right to challenge his authority as the executor of the family will. I printed the document on the heavy premium paper provided by the hotel. As I read the physical copy, I actually smiled. Preston was so obsessively focused on the will. He truly believed the will was the ultimate key to the $32 million. He had absolutely no idea how generational wealth actually works. A will only governs assets that are explicitly left in the deceased person's direct name at the exact time of their death. Our parents had transferred the commercial real estate, the corporate intellectual property, the massive fleet of shipping trucks, and the vast majority of their liquid capital into an irrevocable trust 3 full years ago. The trust operated completely independently of the will. By signing his little waiver, I was not giving up anything of actual value. I was only agreeing not to fight him over the empty shell of a document that basically handed him a heavily mortgaged house and a worthless company title. The will was just an empty box, and Preston was fiercely guarding it while I owned the steel vault the box was sitting inside. But I needed to make my response absolutely airtight, so it could double as a lethal weapon later. I sat down at the business center keyboard and began drafting a devastating legal addendum of my own to attach to his waiver. I titled my document, Declaration of Executor Authority Acceptance. I wrote a formal legal statement acknowledging Preston as the sole and undisputed executor of the will, exactly as he demanded. But I carefully embedded a specific ironclad clause into the middle of the paragraph. I wrote that by accepting this waiver, the executor assumes full, total, and unmitigated personal liability for all existing corporate debts, tax burdens, and operational expenses tied to the named logistics company from this day forward. I reviewed the language meticulously, ensuring every single legal term was precise and binding. I was essentially creating an impenetrable financial firewall around myself. When the time came to trigger the poison pill, Preston would not be able to claim ignorance or try to push the impending financial collapse back onto me. He was demanding total control, so I was legally granting him total responsibility for the massive crushing debt he did not yet know existed. I printed my addendum, attached it neatly to the back of his waiver, and signed my name in smooth black ink. I scanned the entire completed packet and sent it directly to Preston's email with a brief message telling him the signed documents were delivered. I knew he would be popping expensive champagne the absolute moment he saw my signature, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just wrapped his own hands tightly around his own throat. The smear campaign and the extortion attempt had backfired spectacularly, and my brother had just knowingly handed me the match to burn his fragile empire to the ground. 2 days later, my firm network alerted me to a massive withdrawal from the primary logistics company operating account. It was a charge for $45,000 made out to the Oak Brook Country Club. Preston was not just hosting a memorial dinner to honor our late parents. He was throwing a lavish networking gala using the commercial operating funds that were legally earmarked for warehouse employee payroll and diesel fuel. He was literally draining the lifeblood of the company to buy expensive steaks and top-shelf liquor for the local elite. In my line of work, we call this commingling of funds. It is a massive red flag that usually precedes a total corporate collapse. Preston was treating the business accounts like his own personal piggy bank, assuming no one would ever audit his actions. I opened my hotel closet and pulled out a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the exact suit I wore when testifying in federal court against corporate embezzlers. It was my armor. I pinned my hair back, applied a single coat of dark red lipstick, and called an executive car service. I did not need to scream or cry to make an impact. I just needed to show up and let my presence shatter the illusion he was trying so desperately to build. The Oak Brook Country Club is an aggressively exclusive establishment nestled in the wealthy suburbs, characterized by sprawling golf courses and valet lines filled with imported sports cars. When I arrived, the valet took my vehicle and I walked up the wide stone steps toward the grand ballroom. The heavy oak double doors were propped open by 2 uniformed staff members. I stepped into the threshold and paused, taking in the sheer audacity of the event. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of round tables draped in heavy white linen and adorned with massive floral centerpieces. Waiters in crisp black vests circulated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the far corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the evening. This was not a quiet space for grieving family members to share fond memories. This was a coronation. Preston had invited all the wealthy socialites, local politicians, and high-rolling investors in the area, attempting to establish himself as the new young king of the local business community. As I stepped further into the room, conversations nearest to me began to abruptly halt. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd like a sudden chill in the air. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely unreadable. I had not been invited, but I walked with the absolute authority of someone who owned the very floor they were standing on. Before I could even locate my brother in the sea of designer suits and expensive evening gowns, a small blockade of relatives moved to intercept me. It was Aunt Susan and Uncle Greg, my father's younger brother, and his wife. They were flanked by a few other distant cousins, all wearing matching expressions of deep disapproval. They had clearly watched Naomi's tearful social media broadcast and swallowed every single fabricated word without a second thought. They saw me as the ungrateful squatter coming to ruin their luxurious free dinner. "Claire, what on earth are you doing here?" Aunt Susan hissed, grabbing my forearm with her claw, like grip to stop my forward momentum. "You are going to ruin this beautiful evening for your brother. Has he not been through enough stress dealing with you this week? Look at you marching in here like you own the place." I calmly looked down at her hand, resting on my tailored sleeve, until she awkwardly pulled it away. "I am here to attend the memorial dinner for my parents, Susan," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I assumed my formal invitation was simply lost in the mail, along with my childhood belongings. Uncle Greg crossed his arms, his face flushed with self-righteous anger. "Do not play games, Claire," he scolded, lowering his voice so the nearby wealthy guests would not overhear the messy family drama. "We all know exactly what you tried to do. Naomi told us how you refused to leave the estate and tried to hoard your parents' assets for yourself. You should be ashamed of yourself acting like a spoiled brat after they paid for your entire college education and let you live rent-free." I stared at my uncle, a man who had asked my father for a personal loan every single Christmas for the past 2 decades, just to keep his own failing hardware store afloat. The sheer hypocrisy was almost comical. Preston and Naomi had spun a masterful web of lies, painting me as the greedy villain, while they were literally funding this opulent party with stolen corporate money. "You need to stop being so stubborn and overly emotional," Aunt Susan chimed in, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "Preston is the man of the family now. He has the business background and the grand vision to take the logistics company to the next level. You just crunch numbers in a boring cubicle all day. You need to step aside, let the men handle the heavy lifting of the business, and accept your place. Preston told us he generously offered you $10,000 to help you get on your feet. You need to take that money, apologize to him and Naomi, and move on with your little life before you embarrass yourself further." I listened to their misguided lecture without interrupting. In forensic accounting, we call these people useful idiots. They are the individuals who blindly support the fraudster because they are charmed by the illusion of success and the promise of proximity to wealth. Arguing with them is a complete waste of time because they do not operate on facts. They operate on the emotional narrative they have been fed. I did not defend myself. I did not mention that I had just spent 3 years wiping our parents' mouths and dispensing their liquid morphine while Preston partied in Miami. I did not tell them that the $10,000 pity check was actually a criminal extortion attempt funded by my own stolen savings. I simply offered them a tight, polite smile. "Thank you for your invaluable financial advice, Uncle Greg," I said, my tone so dangerously polite it made him blink in confusion. "But I am not here to discuss my little life with you." I stepped around them, completely ignoring Susan's indignant gasp. I scanned the massive ballroom and finally spotted my target. Preston was standing near the grand fireplace at the far end of the room, holding court. He had a crystal tumbler of amber liquor in one hand and a lit imported cigar in the other, laughing loudly at his own joke. He was surrounded by a tight circle of older, wealthy men. I recognized several of them immediately from my firm's regional business profiles. They were prominent local investors, aggressive venture capitalists, and commercial real estate developers known for buying up distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. Naomi was standing a few feet away from him, chatting with a group of society wives, showing off a massive diamond tennis bracelet that definitely had not been in her jewelry box last week. She happened to glance up and lock eyes with me across the room. Her smile instantly vanished. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face, and she subtly nudged Preston in the ribs to alert him to my presence. Preston stopped laughing. He turned his head and saw me cutting a direct path through the crowd straight toward him. His arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, plastering on a fake welcoming smile for the benefit of his wealthy audience. He thought I was coming to cause an emotional scene. He thought I was going to cry and beg for my childhood belongings in front of the local elite, thereby proving Naomi's narrative that I was an unstable, hysterical woman. As I walked closer, I could hear fragments of the conversation he was having with the investors. He was speaking loudly, entirely too confident in his own amateur business terminology. "We are looking at a complete structural reorganization," Preston boasted to a silver-haired developer. "The logistics company has a massive fleet of heavy transport trucks and 3 prime commercial warehouse locations. I am planning to liquidate the outdated physical assets, streamline the operations, and pivot the entire brand into a digital freight brokerage. We can sell off the land to commercial developers like yourself for a massive upfront capital injection. It is a gold mine just waiting for a modern visionary to unlock it." The silver-haired developer nodded, looking intrigued but cautious. "It sounds like a bold move," he said, swirling the ice in his drink. "Liquidating a $32 million physical logistics fleet is a massive undertaking. Are you prepared for the operational friction and the inevitable tax hurdles?" "Absolutely." Preston lied smoothly, taking a confident drag from his expensive cigar. "I have full executive control. The transition will be completely seamless." I stopped directly behind the circle of men. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I simply waited for a slight pause in the conversation, and then I stepped seamlessly into the ring of investors, standing shoulder to shoulder with the silver-haired developer. "That is a fascinating strategy, Preston," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the lively string quartet. The group of older men turned to look at me, surprised by the sudden interruption. Preston stiffened his grip, tightening dangerously around his crystal glass. He tried to laugh it off, shooting the investors a knowing, long-suffering look, meant to paint me as the crazy sister. "Gentlemen, this is my younger sister, Claire," Preston said, his voice dripping with forced patience. "She has been having a very difficult time accepting the new estate dynamics. Claire, this is a private business discussion. Why do you not go find Aunt Susan and get yourself a plate from the buffet?" I did not break eye contact with him. I smiled a sharp, predatory smile that made the silver-haired developer shift slightly on his feet. I was not there to eat the catered food he bought with my stolen money. I was there to drop a forensic financial bomb right in the middle of his fantasy kingdom. I smiled politely at the silver-haired developer before turning my full attention back to my brother. "Liquidating the physical assets of a $32 million logistics fleet is certainly an aggressive strategy," I said, keeping my tone conversational, but loud enough for the entire circle of influential men to hear. "But I am genuinely curious, Preston. How exactly are you planning to bypass the Subchapter S corporate tax liabilities for the upcoming fiscal quarter if you liquidate the fleet?" Preston froze. The confident, arrogant smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked exactly like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming 18-wheeler. I did not let him off the hook. I took half a step closer, invading his space and forcing him to look at me. "Because, as you know, the commercial vehicles and warehouses have been heavily depreciated on the books for the last decade," I continued, explaining the harsh financial reality to the group of investors. "If you execute a massive liquidation sale without a 1031-like kind exchange, you are going to trigger a catastrophic depreciation recapture tax. We are talking about an immediate federal tax burden of at least $8 million due upon the point of sale. Have you already factored that $8 million cash deficit into your digital freight brokerage pivot?" The silence in the circle was deafening. The wealthy investors who had been nodding along with Preston's grand vision just moments ago suddenly shifted their weight and stared at him intently, waiting for his brilliant executive response. In the world of high finance and commercial real estate, there is nothing more repulsive to an investor than a man who pretends to know the numbers but clearly does not. Preston started to sweat. A thick bead of perspiration rolled down his temple. He gripped his crystal tumbler so tightly his knuckles turned white. Well, the tax implications are obviously a factor, he stammered, his voice completely losing its previous booming authority. We have a team of junior accountants who handle the minor details. The capital gains will simply be offset by the corporate restructuring write-offs. It was absolute word salad. It was a string of financial buzzwords he had probably heard on a television show, carelessly mashed together in a desperate attempt to sound competent. The silver-haired developer raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from intrigued to deeply skeptical. Actually, son, he said, his tone entirely patronizing now. Capital gains offsets do not apply to depreciation recapture in a subchapter S corporate structure. Your sister is absolutely right. That is a massive tax bomb. You would be operating at a severe negative deficit before you even launched your new digital platform. Who exactly is auditing your books right now? Preston's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He was being publicly humiliated, exposed as an absolute fraud in front of the exact people he was trying so desperately to impress. He glared at me with pure hatred, his chest heaving under his expensive tailored suit. You have no idea what you are talking about, Claire. He spat, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. You are just a bitter desk clerk trying to ruin my networking event because you are jealous of my success. I am a senior forensic accountant, Preston. I corrected him calmly, refusing to match his frantic energy. And I know exactly what I'm talking about, because I am the one who structured the corporate tax strategy for our parents for the last 6 years. You are driving a multi-million-dollar company straight off a financial cliff, and you do not even know where the brakes are. The investors immediately began physically stepping away from Preston. The silver-haired developer placed his empty drink on a passing waiter's silver tray and gave Preston a tight, dismissive nod. Well, it was certainly an interesting concept, he said smoothly, entirely withdrawing his previous interest. Good luck with the reorganization. We will keep an eye on your progress from a safe distance. Within 30 seconds, the entire circle of influential men had dispersed, leaving Preston standing completely alone, looking like an absolute fool. The illusion of his power was shattered. He was no longer the young visionary king of the local business world. He was just an incompetent heir playing dress-up in his dead father's suit. Before Preston could even formulate a response to his utter humiliation, a blur of motion caught my eye. Naomi came storming across the ballroom floor. She had been watching the interaction from across the room, and she could see the wealthy investors scattering like frightened birds. She knew I had just completely dismantled her husband's grand charade and threatened her new socialite status. She held a full crystal glass of dark red wine in her right hand. As she aggressively approached me, she intentionally stumbled, throwing her weight forward and violently thrusting her arm out. The heavy glass struck my shoulder, and the dark crimson liquid splashed forcefully across my chest, instantly soaking into the expensive charcoal fabric of my tailored suit. Oh my goodness, I am so incredibly clumsy, Naomi shrieked, her voice artificially loud to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. I am so sorry, Claire. I just tripped over the hem of my designer gown. It was the most pathetic, transparent performance I had ever witnessed. Aunt Susan and Uncle Greg hurried over, gasping dramatically at the sight of my ruined outfit. The string quartet seemed to play a little softer as dozens of eyes locked onto the unfolding family drama. Look what you made me do, Naomi hissed, dropping the fake apology the absolute moment we were out of earshot from the wealthy strangers. You are a toxic, bitter monster, Claire. You come into our private memorial event uninvited and try to humiliate my husband. You are pathetic. Leave right now before I have the club security drag you out by your hair. Preston stepped up beside his wife, his face still flushed purple with deep embarrassment. You heard her, Claire, he growled, pointing a shaking finger toward the heavy oak doors. Get out of my party. Get out of my life. You are dead to us. I stood there dripping with expensive red wine. The dark, sticky liquid soaked through my silk blouse, sending a cold, uncomfortable chill against my skin. In a typical family drama, this is the exact moment where the victim bursts into tears, covers her stained face, and runs away in deep shame. This is the moment Naomi and Preston were desperately hoping for. They wanted to break me publicly to prove to everyone that I was the unstable one. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I calmly reached over to a nearby catering table and picked up a crisp white linen napkin. I dabbed the worst of the wine off my lapel with slow, deliberate precision. I took my time letting the tense, uncomfortable silence stretch out across the massive room. I looked at Naomi, who was breathing heavily, clutching her empty wine glass like a weapon. I looked at Preston, whose eyes were filled with desperate, panicked rage. Then I looked past them at Aunt Susan, Uncle Greg, and the sea of distant relatives who had so eagerly bought into their lies. I dropped the stained linen napkin onto the floor right at Preston's polished leather shoes. "Enjoy the open bar, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly and confidently across the silent ballroom. "Drink up and eat well tonight, because it is the absolute last thing my brother will ever be able to afford." I did not wait for a reaction. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand exit. I did not rush. I kept my head held high, my shoulders pulled back, and my strides perfectly even. I could feel the weight of 100 stairs burning into my back, but I did not care. I walked out of the country club and stepped into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of Preston's reputation smoldering on the ballroom floor. The battle lines were officially drawn, and they had absolutely no idea I held the nuclear codes. A full week passed since the disaster at the country club. I did not hear a single word from my brother or his wife. They were entirely too busy living inside their newly constructed delusion of massive wealth. From the quiet sanctuary of my premium hotel suite, I continued to monitor the logistics company bank accounts through my secure encrypted portal. Watching Preston's financial decisions was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. He and Naomi were spending corporate money like it was water pouring from an endless tap. On Tuesday morning, a charge for over $200,000 cleared the main logistics operating account. They had purchased 2 matching luxury sport utility vehicles. They registered both high-end cars directly under the commercial logistics company name, classifying them as corporate fleet vehicles to avoid paying the hefty personal sales tax. It was yet another textbook example of blatant tax fraud. By Thursday afternoon, they had wired a massive $50,000 retainer to an incredibly overpriced interior design firm in the city to begin completely gutting my parents' historic mansion. But this massive, reckless spending spree came with a heavy, immediate price. The logistics company operating accounts were rapidly draining. To compensate for his massive daily withdrawals, Preston decided to trim what he considered the corporate fat. I sat at my laptop and watched the internal payroll ledgers in absolute horror as he began systematically firing the veteran staff. These were the dedicated men and women who had built the commercial empire alongside our late father. Preston terminated the senior warehouse manager who had faithfully run the loading docks for 20 years. He fired the lead commercial freight dispatcher, and he eliminated the entire human resources department in a single afternoon to save on overhead costs. In their place, Preston immediately hired his grossly unqualified friends from his string of failed tech startups. He brought in arrogant men who wore expensive designer sneakers to the warehouse floor and had absolutely zero experience managing heavy freight operations or commercial truck drivers. They treated the multi-million-dollar logistics company like a trendy social club, entirely ignoring the complex daily logistics required to keep the business functional. The operational results were instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. Without the veteran dispatchers managing the intricate daily routing schedules, massive shipping deadlines were completely missed. Fully loaded commercial trucks were sent to the wrong distribution centers across state lines, resulting in spoiled perishable goods and massive late fees. Vital commercial clients who had been fiercely loyal to our father for over a decade began terminating their massive annual contracts due to the sudden severe breach of service. The company was hemorrhaging loyal clients and losing its stellar industry reputation practically overnight. By the end of the week, The stark financial reality was finally catching up to Preston's massive inflated ego. The corporate payroll account was dropping dangerously low. Preston realized he could not simply wait for the standard legal probate process to unfold over the next few months. He needed immediate, unrestricted access to the entire $32 million estate capital to cover his massive mistakes, stop the bleeding, and keep his luxurious lifestyle afloat. He decided to fast-track the total liquidation of the estate. On Friday morning, a heavy courier envelope was delivered directly to the front desk of my hotel. The concierge brought it up to my suite on a silver tray. I sat down at my mahogany desk and opened the thick paper. It was a formal legal cease and desist letter drafted by a cheap strip mall attorney Preston had clearly hired in a desperate panic. The document was aggressively worded. It formally accused me of deliberately harassing the estate executor and attempting to maliciously sabotage corporate networking events. More importantly, the letter explicitly stated that I was legally barred from attending the official will reading, which Preston had hastily scheduled for the following Monday morning at the downtown office of Mr. Harrison, our longtime family estate lawyer. The letter threatened me with immediate local police involvement and severe criminal charges for trespassing if I dared to show my face at the law firm. Preston was absolutely terrified. His cheap legal threat was a glaring sign of his deep, crushing insecurity. He knew that if I was sitting in that room, I would easily expose his massive financial failures to the estate lawyer and completely ruin his chance to cash out the $32 million. He genuinely thought a threatening piece of paper would keep me cowering in my hotel room, entirely defeated and afraid of the police. I carefully folded the cease and desist letter and placed it into my leather briefcase alongside my massive stack of forensic accounting audits. I did not feel intimidated in the slightest. I felt a profound sense of anticipation. Preston thought he was locking me out of the final chapter. He had absolutely no idea that I was the one who wrote the book. I picked up my cell phone and placed a direct call to the senior partners at my accounting firm. It was time to stop quietly watching the train wreck and start laying the steel tracks that would guide my arrogant brother straight off the cliff. I left the luxury hotel early Monday morning and drove straight to my downtown accounting firm. The morning traffic was heavy, but my mind was perfectly clear and terrifyingly calm. My firm occupies the top 3 floors of a towering glass skyscraper right in the heart of the financial district. Walking through the sleek double-glass doors of the lobby, I felt an immediate sense of absolute control. This was my territory. This was the world of hard facts, undeniable numbers, and binding legal contracts where emotional manipulation and family guilt trips hold absolutely no power. I walked past the reception desk, greeted the administrative staff, and stepped into my private corner office. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk, overlooking the waking city. Spread out before me on the secure internal network was the physical manifestation of Project Icarus. I had spent the entire weekend finalizing the audit, and now it was time to print the execution orders. Preston honestly believed our parents had $32 million sitting in a basic checking account, just waiting for him to waltz in and withdraw it to buy a yacht. He thought wealth was just a big pile of cash. But generational wealth is never just cash. It is a complex labyrinth of legal protections and tax shields, and Preston was entirely unarmed for the maze. 5 years ago, after Preston's second major business bankruptcy, our father came to my office in a state of deep panic. He was terrified that if he left the logistics business directly to Preston, my brother's aggressive creditors would easily pierce the corporate veil and seize the entire family legacy to pay off his debts. So I built our parents a financial fortress. Working quietly behind the scenes, I completely restructured the family estate. We split the assets entirely down the middle into 2 very different legal entities. We kept the operating name of the logistics company in our parents' direct names. That company name was essentially just a hollow shell, an empty brand. That was the only thing the will actually covered. But we transferred every single physical asset of real value, the commercial real estate, the distribution centers, the massive fleet of 18-wheelers, the intellectual property, and the vast majority of the liquid investment portfolios into a highly shielded, irrevocable trust. And the sole trustee and 100% beneficiary of that impenetrable trust was me. Preston was fighting to the death over an empty cardboard box, while I legally held the title to the entire warehouse the box was sitting inside. I clicked the print command on my computer. The heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, churning out thick stacks of verified financial documents. I stood by the printer and carefully organized the papers as they fed into the tray. First, I gathered the original trust formation documents bearing our parents' notarized signatures and the state corporate seals. Second, I compiled the commercial property deeds proving unequivocally that the trust owned the land underneath the family mansion, as well as the land beneath every single company warehouse. Third, I printed the detailed bank ledgers, exposing Preston's recent illegal withdrawals, his lavish country club expenses, and the 2 luxury vehicles he had fraudulently purchased using corporate funds. But the most crucial document of all was the final piece of paper that slid from the printer. It was the poison pill clause. Despite his flaws, our father had loved Preston and wanted to leave him a path to earn his keep. Preston was allowed to operate the logistics company name and draw a modest executive salary under one very strict, legally binding condition. He could not ever attempt to displace me from the family home or restrict my access to the estate. By aggressively serving me that 24-hour eviction notice and freezing my personal bank accounts, Preston had legally triggered the poison pill. That single arrogant action instantly revoked all of his operational protections and activated a massive commercial lease agreement, defaulting him into millions of dollars of immediate debt to my trust. I placed the thick stack of verified documents into a sleek black leather portfolio, snapping the metal clasp shut. The trap was fully armed. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the aggressively worded cease and desist letter Preston had sent to my hotel on Friday. The cheap paper felt flimsy in my hands. The strip mall lawyer he hired had cited local trespassing ordinances, threatening me with immediate arrest and police intervention if I dared to attend the official will reading this morning. I read it one last time, savoring the sheer, desperate panic oozing from every single misspelled legal threat. He was terrified of me showing up because he knew his entire empire was built on sand. I held the letter over the heavy-duty industrial shredder sitting under my desk. I let it slip from my fingers. The loud grinding noise of the steel blades chewing his empty threats into tiny, unrecognizable strips of confetti was incredibly satisfying. I did not need his permission to attend a meeting about my own property. I picked up my black leather portfolio, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket, and walked out of my office. I marched straight down the carpeted hallway toward the grand executive suite belonging to the 2 senior founding partners of my firm, Thomas and Richard. They were brilliant, ruthless corporate litigators who charged $1,000 an hour, and they knew my family history intimately. They had mentored me for years and despised white-collar bullies like my brother. I knocked twice on their open glass door. They both looked up from their respective desks. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, offering a tight, confident smile. "I have a highly volatile estate reading across town in exactly 1 hour. The executor is currently embezzling corporate funds and has threatened me with police action if I attend. I need 2 heavy hitters to walk into that room with me and watch me execute a hostile corporate takeover of my own family." Thomas slowly closed his laptop, a dangerous, calculating gleam in his eye. Richard stood up, brushing an invisible piece of lint from his expensive suit, and adjusted his silk tie. They did not ask any questions. They knew exactly what Project Icarus was, and they had been waiting for this day just as long as I had. Thomas grabbed his briefcase and smiled. "Let us go ruin his day," he said. Thomas, Richard, and I took the private executive town car from our firm across the city to the prestigious law offices of Mr. Harrison. The ride was quiet and focused. We did not need to review our strategy because the financial documents sitting inside my black leather portfolio were absolute and legally bulletproof. Mr. Harrison operated his practice out of a historic pre-war building in the oldest and most expensive section of the downtown district. He was an old-school estate attorney who had managed my parents' legal affairs for over 30 years. He despised modern flashiness and valued discretion above all else. We took the private elevator up to his floor and stepped into his waiting room. The space was intimidating by design. It featured dark mahogany-paneled walls, antique Persian rugs, and heavy leather wingback chairs that smelled faintly of expensive cigar smoke and old paper. The receptionist, an older woman named Mrs. Higgins, sat behind a massive oak desk, typing quietly on her computer. She looked up and offered me a small, sympathetic smile before returning to her work. I sat down in the center leather chair. Thomas sat to my left, and Richard sat to my right. We placed our matching black briefcases on the polished mahogany coffee table in front of us, and we waited in absolute silence. Exactly 15 minutes past the scheduled appointment time, the heavy brass handles of the double-glass doors turned and the doors swung open violently. Preston and Naomi made their grand entrance. They did not look like grieving family members arriving to finalize the solemn legal affairs of their deceased parents. They looked like they were walking the red carpet at a celebrity award show. Preston was wearing a custom-tailored three-piece suit in a garish shade of navy blue, paired with a massive gold luxury watch that peeked out from under his crisp white cuff. The watch alone cost more than most people earned in an entire year, and I knew exactly which corporate account he had drained to buy it. Naomi was dripping in newly acquired wealth. She wore a bright crimson designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a legal office, and she carried a limited edition handbag that screamed newly rich. She had oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair, and she was actively complaining to Preston about the lack of premium valet parking outside the building. They strutted toward the reception desk entirely absorbed in their own manufactured importance. Preston leaned heavily on the oak counter and tapped his gold watch, demanding that Mrs. Higgins tell Mr. Harrison the new owner of the logistics company had finally arrived. As he turned his head to survey the waiting room, his eyes caught a glimpse of me sitting quietly in the corner. He stopped dead in his tracks. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face so quickly it was almost comical. Naomi bumped into his shoulder, confused by his sudden halt, until she followed his gaze and saw me sitting there. Her jaw actually dropped open in shock. They stared at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. They had been so absolutely certain that their cheap legal threats and social media bullying would keep me cowering in my hotel room. They expected to walk into this office unchallenged and walk out as multimillionaires. Instead, they were looking at the one person who knew exactly how empty their pockets truly were. Preston's eyes darted away from me and landed on the two men sitting on either side of my chair. Thomas was casually reading a financial newspaper, his legs crossed, displaying his expensive Italian leather shoes. Richard was checking his phone, his custom-tailored charcoal suit projecting an aura of absolute corporate dominance. Even to an amateur like Preston, it was immediately obvious that these were not cheap strip mall lawyers. These were apex predators in the corporate legal world, and they were sitting shoulder to shoulder with his little sister. The initial shock quickly mutated into frantic, desperate anger. Preston's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and turned back to the receptionist. "What is she doing here?" Preston yelled, his voice echoing loudly against the mahogany walls. "I sent her a legally binding cease and desist order. She is formally barred from attending this meeting. I want her thrown out of this building immediately." Mrs. Higgins simply adjusted her reading glasses and looked at Preston with mild distaste. "She is an immediate family member, sir," she replied, her voice perfectly calm. "Mr. Harrison instructed me to allow her to wait." "I do not care what you were instructed to do," Preston screamed, slamming his hand flat against the oak desk. "I am the sole executor of the estate. I make the rules now. You pick up that phone and you call the building security right this second. If they will not drag her out, I will call the local police and have her arrested for criminal trespassing. She has absolutely no right to be in this room." Naomi stepped up beside him, crossing her arms and attempting to look intimidating. "You need to leave right now, Claire," Naomi demanded, her voice shrill and panicking. "You are embarrassing yourself. Preston has all the legal power here, and you are just making things worse for yourself by showing up with these rented lawyers." Thomas slowly lowered his financial newspaper. He folded it neatly, placed it on the coffee table, and stood up. He was a tall, imposing man, and the moment he stood, the entire power dynamic in the room shifted. He did not yell, he did not look angry. He simply looked at Preston the way a scientist looks at an interesting insect under a microscope. "I assume you are Preston?" Thomas said, his deep voice completely commanding the room. "My name is Thomas Sterling, senior partner at the forensic accounting and litigation firm, where your sister is a highly valued director. The cease and desist letter you mailed to her hotel on Friday was legally frivolous, entirely unenforceable, and frankly an embarrassment to the legal profession. It has been shredded. If you ever attempt to threaten my client with false police action again, I will personally bury you under so many federal harassment lawsuits your grandchildren will be paying the legal fees. Do we understand each other?" Preston took a physical step backward, swallowing hard. He tried to maintain his aggressive posture, but his confidence was rapidly crumbling. He was a bully who was entirely used to getting his way by shouting loudly at people who were too tired to fight back. He had absolutely no idea how to handle a man like Thomas, who was completely immune to his childish tantrums. "I am the executor," Preston stammered, his voice losing its booming volume. "I have the legal right to a private will reading. She is trying to steal my inheritance." Before Thomas could deliver another verbal strike, the heavy wooden door to the inner office clicked loudly and swung open. Mr. Harrison stepped out into the waiting room. He was a distinguished man in his late 60s, wearing a simple gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He held a thick manila folder in his hands, and he looked incredibly tired. He had likely spent his entire morning reviewing the chaotic financial mess Preston was actively creating. Mr. Harrison surveyed the room. He looked at Thomas and Richard, offering them a brief, respectful nod of professional recognition. He looked at me and offered a small, reassuring smile. Finally, his eyes landed on Preston and Naomi, and his expression instantly hardened into pure professional disdain. "Mr. Harrison." Preston practically whined, rushing toward the attorney like a child tattling to a teacher. "You need to fix this right now. Tell my sister to get out of your office. She is entirely cut out of the will, and she has no business being here while we discuss my logistics empire. If she stays, I am walking out that door and taking my multi-million-dollar legal business to another firm." The waiting room fell completely silent. Mr. Harrison did not blink. He did not look intimidated by the threat of losing Preston's supposed business. He simply pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose, looked Preston dead in the eyes, and delivered a statement that shattered the room. "Claire stays," Mr. Harrison stated coldly, his voice echoing in the quiet space. "In fact, Preston, if she was not sitting in that chair right now, you would be walking out of here today with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back." Preston froze, entirely paralyzed by the sheer weight of those words. Naomi let out a tiny gasp of confusion, her hand flying up to touch her expensive diamond necklace. They both stared at the old lawyer, completely unable to comprehend the reality crashing down around them. Now Mr. Harrison continued, stepping aside and gesturing toward his open office door. "I suggest everyone take a seat at the conference table. We have a massive amount of corporate debt to discuss, and time is entirely running out." I picked up my black leather portfolio and walked past my brother without looking at him. Thomas and right behind me, framing me like an impenetrable wall of legal armor. The battle for the illusion of control was over. The real war over the numbers was about to begin, and I had already won. We followed Mr. Harrison into his spacious inner office. The room smelled of old leather-bound books and expensive polish. A massive mahogany desk anchored the room, surrounded by tall windows that overlooked the bustling downtown financial district. I took a seat in one of the heavy leather chairs directly in front of the desk. Thomas sat to my immediate right, placing his sleek briefcase on his lap, while Richard took the chair to my left. Together we formed an impenetrable physical wall. Preston and Naomi were forced to sit on the opposite end of the seating arrangement, on a smaller leather sofa that made them look awkwardly positioned and completely out of their depth. Preston was still breathing heavily from his embarrassing tantrum in the waiting room, but he desperately tried to smooth his tailored suit jacket and adopt an air of executive authority. Naomi sat stiffly beside him, her bright crimson designer dress clashing violently with the muted professional tones of the law office. Her expensive designer handbag was clutched tightly in her lap, and her eyes darted nervously between my high-powered corporate attorneys and the stoic estate lawyer. She could feel the power dynamic shifting away from her husband, but she was too arrogant to fully understand why. Before Mr. Harrison could even open the thick manila folder resting in the center of his desk, Preston aggressively leaned forward. He reached inside the breast pocket of his custom navy blue suit and pulled out 2 pieces of folded paper. He slapped them down onto the polished wood and slid them forcefully across the desk toward Mr. Harrison. "Let us skip the usual depressing legal formalities and get straight to the point, Mr. Harrison Preston," said his voice dripping with forced bravado. "I am a very busy man, and I have a multi-million-dollar company to run. Those documents right there legally authorize me to clear this entire estate today." Mr. Harrison looked down at the papers but did not touch them. He kept his hands folded neatly over his own files. "The top page is a copy of the formal eviction notice. I personally served my sister last week." Preston continued, gesturing broadly toward the desk. "It proves she has officially vacated the primary residence and has no legal claim to the property. The second page is a legally binding waiver signed by Claire herself, fully surrendering any and all rights to contest my authority as the sole executor. She signed it willingly. She is officially out of the picture. Her presence in this room today is a complete waste of your billable hours." I sat perfectly still listening to him brag about the waiver. He was so blindingly arrogant that he had clearly never bothered to read the second page of that document. He had no idea about the ironclad addendum I had attached, stating he assumed full personal liability for all corporate debts. He just saw my signature at the bottom and assumed he had won the war. Preston leaned back on the leather sofa, crossing his legs and resting his arm along the back cushion, attempting to look like a relaxed billionaire who held all the cards. "Since I am the sole heir and the only beneficiary of the logistics empire, I want the $32 million in liquid funds released into my personal accounts by the end of the business hour." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the quiet room. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, a dark, amused glint appearing in his eyes. Richard wrote something down on his legal pad, his expression entirely unreadable. In the real world of corporate finance and estate law, you cannot simply wire millions of dollars from a probate estate to a personal checking account on a Tuesday afternoon. It requires months of judicial oversight, tax clearances, and formal audits. Preston's demand proved he had absolutely zero financial literacy. "I have already brokered a private deal for a 90-foot luxury yacht currently docked in Miami," Preston boasted, entirely oblivious to the silent judgment radiating from my lawyers. "I need to wire the seller a $5 million down payment by tomorrow morning to secure the vessel. I also want the property deeds to the family mansion and the commercial warehouses transferred directly into my new holding company today. I have a team of luxury interior decorators and commercial contractors waiting for my green light, and I cannot have any bureaucratic legal red tape holding up my renovation schedule. Clear the accounts, Mr. Harrison. I want this done now." Mr. Harrison did not reach for the papers Preston had thrown onto his desk. He did not type anything into his computer. He sat perfectly still, his hands remaining folded over the closed manila folder containing the actual estate documents. He looked at Preston for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of absolute silence that precedes a massive, destructive storm. I kept my eyes locked directly on my brother, watching the arrogant smirk on his face slowly begin to fracture under the weight of the lawyer's silent, unwavering stare. Preston shifted uncomfortably, his custom leather shoes squeaking slightly against the hardwood floor. Naomi leaned forward, her heavy diamond tennis bracelet clinking against the wooden armrest of the sofa. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, her voice tight and defensive. "My husband just gave you his legal instructions as the executor of the estate. We are paying you a very high hourly rate to execute his orders, not to sit there and stare at us." Mr. Harrison let out a long, heavy sigh. The sound seemed to drain whatever remaining warmth existed in the room. He slowly reached up and pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. He looked at Preston with a mixture of profound, professional exhaustion and genuine, undeniable pity. "Preston, did you even read the will?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or did you just read the cover page?" Preston blinked, his face contorting into a mask of deep confusion. "What are you talking about?" He snapped, his voice sharp with defensiveness. "Of course I read the will. It is only 5 pages long. Paragraph 2 explicitly names me as the sole executor. Paragraph 4 names me as the primary heir to the family residence. And paragraph 5 transfers total ownership of the logistics company directly to me. It is written in plain English. Now stop playing games and release my money." Mr. Harrison did not raise his voice. He slowly opened the thick manila folder resting on his desk and deliberately spread the documents out across the polished mahogany surface. "You are absolutely correct, Preston," he said, his tone entirely clinical. "The will does name you as the executor. It does leave the physical structure of the family mansion to you. And it does transfer the operating title of the logistics company into your name." Preston threw his hands up in the air, turning to look at Naomi with a vindicated smirk. "See?" he said loudly, gesturing toward the lawyer. "I told you this was a complete waste of time. He just admitted I own everything." "You own the name Preston," Mr. Harrison corrected him softly. "You own the legal trademark of the logistics company, and you own the physical bricks of the house you are currently standing in, but you do not own the $32 million. Preston's triumphant smile vanished. He slowly turned his head back to face the desk, his brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. "What do you mean I do not own the money?" he demanded, gripping the edge of the leather sofa. "The company is worth $32 million. You just said I own the company." Mr. Harrison reached into the manila folder and pulled out a second document. This one was significantly thicker, bound in a heavy blue legal cover with a raised gold notary seal stamped on the front page. He placed it squarely in the center of the desk. "3 years ago, your parents came into this exact office in a state of severe distress." Mr. Harrison explained, his voice dropping to a somber professional register. "They had just quietly paid off the massive debts from your second failed technology startup to keep you out of federal bankruptcy court. They loved you, Preston, but they were terrified of your reckless financial history. They knew with absolute certainty that if they left the family empire directly in your hands, your aggressive creditors and your complete lack of business management skills would bankrupt the family legacy within a year." Naomi shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, her eyes locked onto the thick blue document. "What did they do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They hired a brilliant forensic accountant to build a financial fortress around the estate," Mr. Harrison said, gesturing subtly toward me. "Under her direct guidance, we executed a massive corporate restructuring. We legally decoupled the operating name of the logistics company from the actual physical and financial assets." Preston shook his head rapidly, as if trying to physically dislodge the words he was hearing. "That is impossible," he sputtered. "I have been running the company all week. I bought 2 luxury vehicles with the corporate accounts. I fired the staff. I am the chief executive officer." "You are the chief executive officer of an empty cardboard box," Mr. Harrison stated flatly. The will you read only governs the probate estate, which currently consists of a heavily mortgaged house and a hollow corporate title. The actual wealth of this family is governed by an entirely different legal entity. Mr. Harrison tapped the thick blue document with his index finger. 3 years ago, your parents created an impenetrable, irrevocable trust. They legally transferred every single asset of actual value out of their personal names and deposited them directly into this trust. He adjusted his glasses and began to read from the legal summary page. The trust exclusively owns the commercial real estate deeds for all 3 distribution warehouses. The trust owns the massive fleet of heavy transport trucks and the commercial shipping trailers. The trust holds the exclusive intellectual property rights, the proprietary dispatch software, and the vendor contracts. And most importantly, the trust holds the entire $32 million of liquid investment capital. The room fell so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the office. The absolute magnitude of the legal maneuver was finally crashing down on Preston's shoulders. He had spent the last 2 weeks acting like a billionaire king, throwing lavish country club parties and gutting our childhood home, entirely convinced he was untouchable. He had mocked my accounting degree, telling me I had 0 business instincts. He had thrown all of my childhood belongings into a rusted dumpster and tried to extort me with my own frozen savings. And the entire time he was fighting for a worthless piece of paper, while the actual $32 million fortune was locked away in a titanium vault he did not even know existed. Preston's face turned a sickening shade of pale gray. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He stared at the thick blue document on the desk, his eyes wide with rising terror. The luxury yacht he had just bragged about brokering, the expensive interior decorators he had put on retainer, the massive luxury vehicles he had just illegally purchased. He suddenly realized he had absolutely no way to pay for any of it. "Wait!" Naomi said, her voice trembling with sudden panicked desperation. She leaned forward, gripping Preston's arm so tightly her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into his expensive suit jacket. If the trust owns the money and the trust owns the real estate, then who controls the trust? Preston slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant swagger, the booming executive voice, the cruel, condescending smirk, all of it was completely gone. He looked exactly like the terrified, incompetent little boy he had always been whenever his reckless actions finally caught up with him. He knew the answer before the lawyer even opened his mouth, but he was completely paralyzed by the sheer horror of the reality. Mr. Harrison did not look at Preston when he delivered the final crushing blow. He looked directly at Naomi, answering her desperate question with absolute legal finality. The sole trustee, Mr. Harrison revealed, his voice ringing with undeniable authority, and the 100% beneficiary of the irrevocable trust is Claire. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by a loud, dull thud. Naomi had gone entirely limp with shock, and her expensive designer handbag slipped from her manicured fingers, crashing onto the hardwood floor. Her custom lipstick rolled out across the Persian rug, but she did not even blink or reach down to retrieve it. She was staring at me with a look of absolute unadulterated terror, as the massive financial reality completely crushed her grand socialite fantasy. Preston sat completely immobilized on the leather sofa. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and was hanging entirely suspended in midair, realizing the ground was rushing up to meet him. His mouth opened and closed silently, but he could not force a single word past his vocal cords. Mr. Harrison let the reality settle over them for a long, heavy moment before he continued. He reached out and gently tapped the crisp white eviction notice that Preston had so aggressively slammed onto the mahogany desk just minutes earlier. "Your parents did not want to leave you destitute, Preston." Mr. Harrison explained, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "They actually left you a very comfortable safety net. Under the original terms of the estate, you were fully authorized to retain the chief executive title of the logistics company. You were permitted to draw a generous 6-figure annual salary. You were even allowed to live comfortably in the family mansion for the rest of your life. They wanted you to have the prestige you so desperately craved without giving you the power to bankrupt the family. Preston finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, desperate whisper. Then why, he stammered, his eyes darting wildly between the lawyer and the documents. Why is she the trustee? Why does she control everything? Because your parents knew exactly who you are, Mr. Harrison stated firmly. They knew you were greedy, they knew you were arrogant, and they knew that the absolute second they were no longer here to protect Claire, you would try to cast her out, so they built a behavioral contingency into the legal framework. A poison pill. Mr. Harrison picked up the eviction notice and held it up for Preston to see. You were allowed to enjoy the wealth of the estate under one strict, legally binding condition. You had to share the family home with your sister, and you could never attempt to dispossess her or restrict her access to the assets. The trust documents explicitly state that any hostile action taken against Claire by the executor would instantly trigger a full commercial default. Preston stared at the piece of paper in the lawyer's hand. The very document he thought was his ultimate weapon of dominance was actually his own death warrant. By formally serving Claire with a 24-hour eviction notice and unlawfully freezing her personal bank accounts, you legally severed the familial arrangement, Mr. Harrison concluded, dropping the paper back onto the desk. You triggered the poison pill entirely on your own. Claire did not take your empire away from you, Preston. You handed it to her. Thomas and Richard, the two senior corporate partners sitting on either side of me, subtly shifted in their leather chairs. They did not smile, but the sheer professional satisfaction radiating from them was palpable. The legal trap was fully sprung, and it was finally time for me to take the absolute control of the room. I reached down and unclasped my black leather portfolio. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet office. I pulled out the thick stack of forensic accounting audits and commercial lease agreements I had painstakingly prepared over the weekend. I leaned forward and slid the heavy stack of documents across the polished mahogany desk until it rested squarely in front of my brother. Preston stared at the stack of papers as if it were a live explosive device. Let me explain exactly how your business is going to operate from this exact second forward, Preston, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely professional. As Mr. Harrison established, you currently own the logistics company brand name. You own the corporate logo printed on the side of the trucks. But you do not own the trucks. My trust owns the fleet. Preston swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. You do not own the 3 massive distribution warehouses. I continued tapping the top document with my index finger. My trust holds the commercial real estate deeds to the land and the physical buildings. You also do not own the proprietary dispatch software that manages the daily shipping routes. My trust holds the exclusive intellectual property rights to that technology. Naomi let out a quiet, ragged sob, pressing her hand hard over her mouth. She was finally comprehending the devastating mechanics of my corporate trap. Preston was the chief executive officer of a ghost ship. Since you decided to aggressively evict me from my childhood home and sever our family ties, I am simply honoring your wishes. I told him, my tone completely devoid of any sibling affection. We are no longer operating as a family. We are now operating strictly as a commercial landlord and an independent tenant. And if you want to use my physical trucks, my commercial land, and my proprietary software to run your hollow little company, you are going to pay the standard market rate to lease them. I slid the final piece of paper directly toward him. It was a formal commercial invoice printed on the heavy watermarked paper of my accounting firm. I am officially billing you $150,000 a month in commercial leasing and licensing fees. I announced the massive number hanging heavily in the air. That includes $50,000 a month for the warehouse land leases, $70,000 a month for the heavy fleet rental, and $30,000 a month for the technology licensing. It is a completely fair market rate based on the current industry standard. Preston's eyes bulged out of his head as he stared at the massive total printed at the bottom of the invoice. $150,000. He choked out, his chest heaving with sudden panic. I cannot pay that. The corporate operating accounts are practically empty. I just paid the interior decorators. I just bought the new fleet vehicles. I do not have that kind of liquid cash. That sounds like a massive personal problem for the chief executive officer, I replied coldly, completely unmoved by his desperate panic. Perhaps you should not have fired the veteran staff who actually knew how to generate corporate revenue. Perhaps you should not have drained the operating accounts to buy expensive steaks for local investors at the country club. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. I also want to draw your attention to the legal waiver you so proudly handed to Mr. Harrison today, I added, gesturing toward the paper on the desk. You were so eager to get my signature that you entirely failed to read the addendum I attached. By accepting my waiver, you legally assumed full personal liability for all corporate debts tied to the logistics company. Preston's jaw dropped open. He looked at Mr. Harrison silently, begging the lawyer to tell him I was lying. Mr. Harrison simply nodded, confirming the absolute legality of my trap. That means you cannot just declare corporate bankruptcy and walk away, Preston. I explained the final crushing detail of his ruin. That $150,000 monthly bill is attached directly to your personal Social Security number. If you default, my trust will legally seize your personal assets. I will take your expensive tailored suits, I will take your luxury watches, and I will take the very house you are standing in. I looked at the heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist and offered him a single razor-thin smile. Your first commercial rent payment is due immediately, I told him. If the $150,000 is not wired into my trust account within 48 hours, I will padlock the warehouse doors. I will shut down the dispatch software, and I will call the police to report every single truck in the fleet as a stolen vehicle. Your entire empire dies in 2 days. The clock is officially ticking, brother. For a long, heavy second, the room was completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic outside the tall windows. Then, Preston absolutely lost his mind. His psychological break was instantaneous and violent. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, completely shattering his fake executive persona. He screamed that the trust documents were a massive forgery. He shouted that I had manipulated our dying parents in their final hours, and that I had somehow bribed Mr. Harrison to steal his empire. He did not just yell. He physically lunged across the massive mahogany desk, reaching his hands out violently toward my throat. Thick, legal papers flew everywhere, fluttering through the air as his knee slammed hard into the polished wood, scattering Mr. Harrison's carefully organized files. Thomas and Richard moved with terrifying speed. They were corporate lawyers, but they were also large, intimidating men who did not tolerate physical threats against their clients. Before Preston's hands could even come close to my face, Thomas stepped forward and grabbed him roughly by the lapels of his expensive custom suit. Thomas violently shoved my brother backward with an immense amount of force. Preston stumbled awkwardly, his arms flailing, and crashed hard onto the leather sofa right next to Naomi. Richard immediately stepped right in front of my chair, creating an impenetrable physical shield between me and my brother. Richard pulled out his cell phone and held it up. He stated in a deadly calm professional voice that if Preston moved a single muscle, he would dial the police and personally ensure Preston was charged with felony assault. Mr. Harrison stood up behind his desk, his face flushed bright red with extreme professional outrage. He pointed a shaking finger at Preston and demanded that he sit down and compose himself instantly, or the building security team would physically drag him out of the office and ban him from the premises permanently. Preston sat frozen on the sofa, panting heavily. His expensive custom suit was deeply wrinkled, and his perfectly styled hair was completely disheveled. He looked entirely pathetic. Naomi stared at her husband as if he were a disgusting disease she had suddenly contracted. The grand illusion of his extreme wealth had entirely evaporated right before her eyes, leaving behind nothing but millions of dollars in immediate crushing personal debt. She realized in a blinding flash of clarity that she was legally bound to a man who was about to lose everything. The massive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist and the expensive designer handbag on the floor were suddenly symbols of a catastrophic financial collapse. Naomi instantly flipped the script. The cruel, arrogant woman who had intentionally spilled dark red wine down my chest at the country club completely vanished. The woman who had sneered at my greenhouse and demanded I leave the family property was suddenly entirely gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate actress. She burst into loud, dramatic tears. She physically slid away from Preston on the leather sofa, putting as much distance between them as possible. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Claire, you have to believe me," she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured panic. "I had absolutely no idea he was doing any of this behind your back. He completely lied to me about the will. He forced me to make that horrible video on social media and told me exactly what to say. I told him it was deeply wrong to kick you out of the house after you cared for your parents, but he would not listen to me. He is out of control, Claire. We are family, and you know I would never intentionally try to hurt you." Preston slowly turned his head to look at his wife, his expression caught somewhere between deep shock and utter betrayal. Naomi was publicly throwing him under a heavy commercial bus to save her own skin. I sat perfectly still behind the protective wall of my corporate lawyers. I did not offer Naomi a single word of comfort. I did not grant her the basic human dignity of eye contact. In the world of forensic accounting, we do not negotiate with hostile accomplices who only decide to apologize when their massive fraud is finally exposed. I completely ignored her pathetic theatrical performance. I let her tears fall into the absolute void of my indifference and kept my eyes locked entirely on my brother. Preston was staring at the floor, taking deep, ragged breaths. His entire world had just collapsed, and he was drowning in the rubble. I leaned slightly around Richard to make sure Preston could hear every single word I was about to say. "There is one more piece of crucial business we need to address before I leave this office, Preston," I said, my voice slicing easily through Naomi's fake crying. "I ran a complete audit on the logistics operating accounts this morning from my hotel room. I saw the $200,000 withdrawal clear the bank for the 2 matching luxury sport utility vehicles you purchased last week." Preston slowly looked up, his eyes wide with renewed terror. He had completely forgotten about the cars in the midst of his massive meltdown. "You registered both of those luxury vehicles directly under the commercial logistics company name to avoid paying the hefty personal sales tax," I explained, laying out the trap step by step. "You thought you were being incredibly smart. But as we just firmly established, my trust holds the exclusive legal rights to that corporate identity and all of its commercial credit lines. That means you committed blatant fraud to buy those vehicles, and you are currently engaging in the unauthorized use of my intellectual property to drive them." I stood up from the leather chair and calmly buttoned my charcoal suit jacket. I picked up my black leather portfolio and held it at my side. "You have exactly 48 hours to wire the first $150,000 lease payment directly into my trust account," I told him, delivering the final crushing blow. "If you fail to make that payment by Wednesday morning, I will not just padlock the warehouse doors and shut down your logistics fleet. I will immediately foreclose on the family mansion. I will seize your new luxury vehicles to cover the massive corporate debt you just personally assumed today. You wanted to be the powerful man of the house, Preston. It is finally time for you to pay the mortgage." I turned around and walked toward the heavy oak door. Thomas and Richard followed closely behind me, leaving Preston and Naomi sitting in the wreckage of their own profound greed. Wednesday morning arrived with bright, clear skies and a sharp, bitter chill in the air. I sat at the mahogany desk in my hotel suite, drinking a cup of black coffee and watching the digital clock quietly roll over to exactly 9 in the morning. I pressed the refresh button on the secure banking portal for the irrevocable trust one final time. The screen loaded instantly, displaying the incoming wire transfer queue. The balance remained exactly the same. There was no incoming wire for $150,000. The 48-hour grace period had officially expired, and my brother had formally defaulted on his massive commercial debt. I closed the laptop and placed it securely in my leather briefcase. In the world of high-stakes forensic accounting, there is no room for extensions, pity, or second chances. When a hostile executive defaults, you execute the penalty immediately before they have the opportunity to hide assets or destroy property. Thomas and Richard had already spent the previous afternoon filing the expedited commercial seizure and foreclosure paperwork with the county judge. Because Preston's signature was on the liability waiver, the judge granted the seizure mandate without a single moment of hesitation. I left the luxury hotel and drove my modest sedan directly to the county sheriff's department. I presented the heavily stamped court orders to the desk sergeant. Within 15 minutes, I was pulling out of the precinct parking lot with a marked county sheriff cruiser following closely behind my rear bumper. We drove through the familiar winding roads of the affluent suburban neighborhood. When we turned onto the street of my family estate, I immediately saw the absolute chaotic mess Preston had created. The long, circular cobblestone driveway was completely jammed with luxury commercial vehicles. There were 3 large white vans belonging to the overpriced interior design firm, and a flatbed truck carrying massive rolls of expensive imported silk carpet. Preston had clearly ignored my legal warning, entirely convinced he could somehow talk his way out of the financial trap. He had pushed forward with his lavish renovation plans, spending money he absolutely did not have. I parked my sedan near the heavy wrought iron gates. The county sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Deputy Miller, parked his cruiser right behind me and stepped out. He adjusted his utility belt and gave me a curt, professional nod. We walked up the cobblestone driveway together, weaving between the confused delivery drivers and interior decorators who were actively unloading expensive custom furniture onto the front lawn. The heavy mahogany front doors were propped wide open. We walked right into the grand foyer. The scene inside was a disaster of manufactured wealth. Swatches of expensive wallpaper were taped to the walls, and crystal lighting fixtures were scattered across the floor in protective bubble wrap. Standing in the center of the chaos was Preston. He was frantically shouting into his cell phone, his face slick with nervous sweat, aggressively demanding that a local bank grant him an immediate emergency commercial loan. Naomi was standing nearby wearing a lavish silk morning robe and holding a cup of coffee. She was pointing at the grand staircase, directing 2 workers to tear down the historic wooden banister. Preston heard the heavy footsteps of the sheriff on the imported tile and turned around. The phone slowly slipped from his ear. His eyes locked onto the shiny silver badge pinned to Deputy Miller's uniform, and all the remaining color instantly drained from his face. He looked entirely like a ghost. Naomi dropped her arm, freezing in place, as she saw the uniformed officer standing next to me. The 2 construction workers slowly backed away, sensing the immediate legal danger. "Preston," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the cavernous foyer. "You failed to remit the required commercial lease payment to the trust. You are officially in default." Deputy Miller stepped forward, unfolding the thick stack of court documents. "Preston, you are hereby served with an immediate commercial eviction and asset seizure mandate," the deputy announced, his deep voice commanding absolute authority. "This property now belongs entirely to the trust. You are trespassing. You and your wife have exactly 20 minutes to gather your bare necessities and vacate the premises." 20 minutes. Preston choked out, his voice cracking in sheer panic. "You cannot do this. This is my house. I am the executor of the estate. I have contractors here. I have a massive shipment of custom Italian furniture arriving this afternoon. You cannot just throw me out on the street." Deputy Miller rested his hand casually on his duty belt, entirely unmoved by the frantic outburst. "The judge says otherwise, sir. You have 19 minutes left. If you are not off the property by the time my watch hits the hour, I will place you in handcuffs for criminal trespassing and remove you by force." Naomi let out a shrill, terrified scream. She looked around at the expensive, uninstalled chandeliers and the rolls of silk carpet, realizing that none of it belonged to her. The massive socialite empire she had bragged about online was crumbling into dust right in front of her eyes. Where are we supposed to put our things? Naomi cried out frantically, gripping the lapels of her silk robe. We have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of custom designer clothes upstairs. We have expensive shoes and luxury bags. We need proper luggage boxes. We need a moving truck. I unzipped the front pocket of my leather duffel bag and pulled out a heavy cardboard box. I dropped it onto the floor right at Preston's expensive leather shoes. It was a brand new box of heavy-duty black construction garbage bags. You can use these, I told them, my expression entirely blank. It is exactly how you packed my childhood belongings when you threw them into a rusted dumpster last week. Consider it a poetic family tradition. Preston stared at the box of garbage bags, his jaw trembling violently. The sheer, utter humiliation of the moment finally broke him. He did not scream. He did not lunge at me. He just hung his head in absolute defeat, turned around, and slowly walked up the grand staircase. Naomi let out a pathetic whimpering sound, grabbed the box of plastic bags, and frantically ran up the stairs after him. The head interior decorator, a sharply dressed woman holding a clipboard, cautiously approached me. She looked at the court documents in the sheriff's hand and cleared her throat nervously. "Excuse me," she said, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "The client paid us a $50,000 retainer to gut this house. Should we continue the demolition? The client is entirely bankrupt," I informed her smoothly. "If I were you, I would load your expensive silk carpets and crystal chandeliers back into your trucks immediately. Because if they cross the threshold into this house, they legally become the property of my trust to satisfy his massive commercial debts." The decorator did not need to be told twice. She loudly blew a whistle and yelled for her crew to immediately pack everything back into the vans. 20 minutes later, Preston and Naomi slowly descended the grand staircase. It was the ultimate walk of shame. The arrogant golden boy and his materialistic wife were both dragging huge black plastic garbage bags filled with hastily stuffed Gucci dresses, tailored suits, and expensive designer shoes. The sharp heels of Naomi's luxury boots were poking through the thin black plastic, threatening to tear the bag completely open. Preston was wearing his garish navy blue suit, but the jacket was wrinkled, and his tie was hanging loosely around his neck. Deputy Miller escorted them out the front door and stood on the porch watching closely to ensure they did not try to steal any of the expensive patio furniture. I followed them out, standing at the top of the grand stone steps, entirely unaffected by their misery. They reached the end of the cobblestone driveway and stopped near the wrought iron gates. Preston dropped his heavy trash bags onto the asphalt. He looked wildly up and down the quiet suburban street, searching for the 2 luxury sport utility vehicles he had purchased last week. "Where are the cars?" Preston panicked, patting his empty pockets looking for the keys. "The cars were parked right here last night." They were corporate fleet vehicles purchased with stolen funds, I reminded him from the top of the steps. The repo agency the trust hired towed them away at 3 in the morning. "You do not have cars, Preston. You do not have a house. You do not have a company." Naomi dropped her garbage bags onto the ground. She turned slowly to look at her husband. The heavy makeup on her face was completely smeared from crying, and her eyes were wide with a terrifying manic realization. Preston had completely drained their joint personal savings accounts to pay for the country club memorial dinner and the non-refundable decorator retainers. They were not just losing the mansion, they were literally penniless, standing on the side of the road with their clothes and trash bags. "You lied to me," Naomi shrieked, her voice echoing loudly down the entire street. "You told me you were a millionaire. You told me your father left you everything. You told me we were going to buy a yacht and travel the world. You absolute pathetic fraud." Preston flinched, holding his hands up defensively. "Naomi, please calm down," he begged, his voice whining and desperate. "I can fix this. I just need to make a few calls to my investors. We can stay at a hotel for a few days while I sort out the legal paperwork." "Stay at a hotel?" Naomi screamed hysterically. "With what money, Preston? Your sister just froze everything. You owe her millions of dollars. You are bankrupt. You are completely useless." She reached down and aggressively grabbed her left hand. She struggled for a moment, pulling violently at her finger until her massive, expensive diamond wedding ring slid off. She wound her arm back and threw the heavy piece of jewelry directly at Preston's chest. The ring hit him hard and bounced off, clattering loudly onto the cobblestone driveway. "I am done with you." Naomi spat, her face twisted in pure disgust. "I am not spending the rest of my life married to a broke, pathetic failure who lives in his sister's shadow. Do not ever call me again." A black sedan pulled up to the curb right next to them. Naomi had quietly ordered an Uber premium car while she was packing her garbage bags upstairs. She grabbed her 2 plastic bags, shoved them aggressively into the trunk of the waiting car, and climbed into the back seat without looking back. The car immediately sped away down the street, leaving Preston standing entirely alone. He looked down at his diamond wedding ring sparkling in the dirt next to a pile of black garbage bags. He was completely abandoned, stripped of his unearned title, his stolen wealth, and his fake marriage. The illusion was dead, and the absolute reality of his actions had finally left him with nothing. I stood on the cobblestone driveway, watching Preston walk away until his wrinkled navy blue suit disappeared around the corner of the affluent suburban street. The massive stone mansion behind me was entirely silent. The heavy wooden front doors were still propped wide open, but the chaotic energy of the morning had completely vanished. The interior decorators had packed up their expensive silk carpets and their crystal chandeliers in record time, leaving the grand foyer completely bare and echoing with emptiness. I walked back inside, allowing the heavy oak doors to click firmly shut behind me. I walked slowly through the massive, formal living room, tracing my fingers over the cold marble fireplace. This house held 34 years of memories, but very few of them were actually warm. It was a fortress of heavy expectations and a towering monument to my parents' conditional love. It was the place where I was constantly reminded that I was the secondary child, the quiet worker bee, meant to support the golden sun. Preston had wanted to gut this building and turn it into a tacky display of his unearned wealth. I had a much more permanent and deeply satisfying solution in mind. I did not pack my bags and move back into the master bedroom. I did not want to sleep under the same roof where I had spent 3 grueling years administering liquid morphine, organizing pill bottles, and watching my own youth slip away in the quiet service of others. Instead, I picked up my phone and called a prominent commercial real estate developer I had worked with extensively during my years at the accounting firm. By Friday afternoon, we had signed a massive commercial land contract. The developer purchased the entire 5-acre estate with the express intention of leveling the mansion and building an exclusive gated community of modern, eco-friendly townhomes. The sale added another $4 million of liquid capital directly into my irrevocable trust. 2 weeks later, I sat in my parked sedan across the street drinking a hot black coffee as I watched the heavy yellow bulldozers tear through the historic stone facade of the mansion. I watched the glass panels of my old greenhouse shatter and fall into the dark dirt. I did not shed a single tear. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound liberation. The physical monument to my family's toxic dynamics was entirely erased from the earth, and the ground was finally cleared for something entirely new. News of the sudden foreclosure and the immediate demolition spread through our wealthy suburban community like a raging wildfire. It did not take long for the country club elite, the local gossips, and my distant relatives to realize exactly what had transpired. They quickly discovered that the fake billionaire they had been praising was actually homeless, and that the quiet sister they had openly mocked was the sole undisputed owner of a $32 million corporate empire. The sheer hypocrisy of my extended family was absolutely staggering to witness. On Monday morning, my cell phone began to ring incessantly. The flying monkeys who had previously told me to step aside and let the men handle the business were suddenly incredibly eager to reconnect with me. Aunt Susan was the first relative to reach out. She left a rambling 5-minute voicemail on my phone. Her voice dripped with fake warmth and manufactured concern. She told me she had always known Preston was acting erratically, and that she had only agreed with him at the country club dinner because she was deeply afraid of his unpredictable temper. She completely glossed over the cruel things she had said to my face. She ended the long message by casually asking if I had any open executive positions at the logistics company for her youngest son, who had recently dropped out of college. Uncle Greg texted me an hour later. He completely ignored the fact that he had publicly humiliated me and instead asked if my corporate trust could issue a $50,000 bridge loan to save his failing hardware store, because family always takes care of family. My cousins flooded my social media inbox with long, emotional apologies and transparent invitations to expensive weekend brunches. Even the wealthy, silver-haired developer from the country club sent a massive floral arrangement to my hotel suite with a card expressing his deep admiration for my ruthless business acumen. In the past, the old version of Claire would have agonized over these messages. I would have felt the crushing, suffocating weight of family obligation. I would have drafted long emotional replies trying to explain my side of the story, trying to justify my actions, and desperately seeking their genuine understanding. But the senior forensic accountant in me knew much better. You do not negotiate with parasites once they are finally detached from the host. I did not reply to Aunt Susan. I did not text Uncle Greg back to explain why I was not an automated teller machine for his bad business decisions. I simply opened my contact list and pressed the block button on every single one of them. I blocked their phone numbers, I blocked their social media profiles, and I instructed my corporate security team to deny them entry to any of my commercial properties. I cut them out of my life with the clean, precise stroke of a surgical scalpel. No screaming matches, no dramatic final confrontations, and absolutely no closure for them. Just the cold, impenetrable wall of my absolute silence. It was the most empowering decision I had ever made in my entire life. With the toxic dead weight of my extended family completely removed, I turned my full attention to the $32 million logistics empire. I officially stepped down from my position at the forensic accounting firm, parting ways with Thomas and Richard on excellent terms. They remained on a highly paid retainer as my primary corporate legal counsel. I walked into the massive glass headquarters of the logistics company, not as the invisible sister, but as the undisputed chief executive officer. My first official act was to legally rebrand the company. I stripped our family name off the side of every single commercial truck and renamed the corporation Icarus Logistics. It was a daily reminder of the boy who flew too close to the sun and burned his own wings. My second act was to aggressively purge the corporate ranks. I fired every single arrogant, unqualified friend Preston had hired during his brief, chaotic reign. I personally called the veteran warehouse managers, the senior commercial freight dispatchers, and the human resources directors that he had wrongfully terminated just weeks prior. I invited them all back to the corporate headquarters and offered them their jobs back with a mandatory 20% salary increase and fully expanded corporate healthcare benefits. The atmosphere in the company transformed almost overnight. The employees returned with fierce loyalty, working tirelessly to repair the damage my brother had caused. We implemented strict forensic accounting protocols, optimizing our commercial routes, and entirely eliminating the wasteful corporate spending that had plagued my father's old management style. Within a single fiscal quarter, our shipping metrics were completely stabilized. We won back the massive commercial contracts we had temporarily lost, and the company began generating record-breaking profits. As for Preston, the reality of his absolute failure was entirely inescapable. He attempted to hire a new lawyer to sue my irrevocable trust, claiming emotional distress and unfair corporate practices. Thomas and Richard crushed his pathetic lawsuit in federal court within a matter of hours, leaving Preston burdened with even more insurmountable legal fees. Naomi finalized their divorce from a different state, refusing to ever speak to him again. The last I heard from the corporate grapevine, my once arrogant brother, who firmly believed he was destined to be a billionaire king, was currently working as a basic package delivery driver for a rival logistics company just to afford the rent on a tiny studio apartment. I felt no pity for him. He had built his own cage, and now he had to live inside it. 6 months have passed since the morning I handed Preston the heavy brass house keys and walked away from my childhood home. I am currently standing in my massive corner office on the top floor of the newly rebranded Icarus Logistics headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling city skyline. The sun is setting, casting a brilliant, warm, golden light across the towering glass skyscrapers and the busy commercial highways below. I am wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, but there are no red wine stains on the lapel. I am completely independent, financially untouchable, and surrounded daily by a dedicated team of professionals who deeply respect my intellect, my work ethic, and my leadership. I often look out over the city and think about my parents and the massive secret they hid inside that thick blue legal binder. They were deeply flawed people who actively enabled my brother's worst character traits for his entire adult life. They allowed him to become an arrogant, entitled monster while treating me like the hired help. But in their final years, when the ultimate reality of their legacy was on the line and the future of the company was at stake, they finally did one thing completely right. They looked past the loud, charismatic son who aggressively demanded everything, and they placed their ultimate trust in the quiet daughter who stayed. They gave me the legal weapon I needed to protect myself, and I used it to forge an entirely new, magnificent life. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor, but sometimes it is the very storm that threatens to sink you. You do not owe your peace of mind, your hard-earned financial stability, or your mental health to people who only value you when you are convenient to their personal narrative. In forensic accounting, we constantly audit corporate ledgers to identify toxic liabilities and remove them to save the business. You must be willing to audit your own personal life with the exact same ruthless precision. If you are sitting in the dark right now, feeling suffocated by the heavy weight of family guilt, or allowing entitled relatives to diminish your fundamental worth, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You hold the absolute power to write your own final chapter. Do not wait for an apology that is never going to come. Set ironclad boundaries. Read the fine print of your own life. Protect your peace, your assets, and your dignity with unwavering strength, and never apologize for stepping into your absolute power. The exact moment you stop seeking validation from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you is the exact moment you become truly unstoppable. Thank you for watching and listening to my journey. Let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to make the incredibly difficult decision to cut toxic family members out of your life in order to find your own success and protect your peace. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe in the power of setting boundaries and taking back your narrative. Remember, your worth is never negotiable, and your best days are always ahead of you.